What if the feeling of being behind was never really about time, but about something much quieter that has been shaping how you see your own life? It can feel convincing in certain moments. Your attention begins to move outward, and it settles on where other people seem to be. Without fully noticing it, you may begin to place yourself somewhere in relation to them. It can feel as if there is a distance between you, even though that distance has never been clearly defined. There can be a quiet sense that you should already be further along, or that something in your life has taken longer than it was meant to. This feeling does not usually arrive as a clear thought. It tends to stay in the background, quietly shaping how you see your experiences. You may notice your mind returning to what has not happened yet. At other times, it can stay with parts of your life that still feel unfinished. Those parts may not be easy to explain. Still, they can feel present in a way that is difficult to ignore. In those moments, time can begin to feel uneven. It can seem as though you are moving through it differently from everyone else around you. The idea of being behind begins to take form in that space. It depends on a sense that there is a sequence you are meant to follow. Even so, that sequence has never been clearly described. And when you look more closely, it does not remain the same. It shifts depending on who you compare yourself to. It changes depending on what you choose to notice. Still, the feeling can remain. Not because it is necessarily true, but because it has been repeated often enough to feel familiar. And familiarity, even when it is not accurate, can begin to feel like something you should trust. The feeling of being behind often begins with comparison, even when you are not fully aware that it is happening. It can start as a simple moment of noticing when your attention moves toward where someone else seems to be in their life. From there, something subtle begins to take shape as you quietly place yourself somewhere in relation to what you are seeing. This does not always feel like judgment, and it does not need to feel negative in order to have an effect. It can feel neutral at first, as if you are simply observing what is already there. Yet within that observation, a reference point begins to form. That reference point becomes a quiet way of measuring where you think you are. The difficulty is that it does not remain fixed. It changes depending on who you are looking at, and it shifts depending on what parts of their life you happen to notice. Because of this, the comparison never fully settles into something stable. It continues to move, often without you realizing it. Your sense of where you stand can begin to follow that movement. Without intending to, you may start adjusting how you see your own progress. This makes it difficult to step out of the pattern because there is no clear moment where it begins or ends. It blends into how you see your life, becoming part of how you understand where you are. Over time, this can create a standard that has never been clearly defined. Even so, it can begin to feel real enough to measure yourself against, And because that standard keeps shifting, it becomes difficult to ever feel like you have truly reached it. The standard you measure yourself against rarely stays in the same place for long. It can seem clear in one moment, and then shift quietly the next, without you fully noticing when it changed. This happens because the reference point is not something fixed. It is shaped by what you are paying attention to at any given time. When your focus moves, the standard moves with it. You may compare one part of your life to someone else's progress, and then later shift your attention to something entirely different. Each time that happens, the sense of what ahead or behind means begins to change. Because of this, there is no stable position to reach. The idea of being behind depends on a moving point, something that continues to adjust without settling. This makes it difficult to feel complete, even when you have made progress in ways that matter to you. You may reach something that once felt important, only to find that your attention has already moved somewhere else. What once felt like enough can begin to feel incomplete, simply because the standard has shifted again. This movement is often quiet. It does not announce itself, and it does not clearly explain why it is changing. Yet it continues in the background, shaping how you evaluate where you are. And because it keeps moving, it becomes harder to recognize that there was never a fixed place you were meant to arrive at. What makes this even harder to notice is how rarely the standard itself is questioned. It can feel natural to assume that the way you are measuring your life is simply how things are meant to be seen. There is often no clear moment where you decide to accept it. It becomes familiar through repetition, and familiarity can make something feel true without needing to be examined. You may find yourself following this sense of progress without asking where it came from. It can feel as though it has always been there, quietly guiding how you interpret your experiences. Because of this, the idea of being behind does not usually feel like a belief. It can feel like a fact, something that does not need to be questioned or explained. This makes it more difficult to step back and see it clearly. When something feels obvious, there is less reason to look at it more closely. The comparison continues, and the standard continues to shift, yet the structure itself remains unexamined. You may adjust your actions, your expectations, and even your sense of self around it. Over time, this can begin to shape how you move through your life, not just in what you do, but in how you feel about what you have done. Even moments that should feel complete can begin to feel uncertain, simply because they are being measured against something that keeps changing. And when the measure itself is never questioned, it can quietly continue to define what feels enough and what never quite does. When a standard like this becomes part of how you see your life, it begins to shape how you feel, even in moments that seem unrelated. You may find that certain experiences carry a quiet weight, not because of what is happening, but because of how they are being measured. There can be a sense that something is not quite enough, even when nothing is clearly missing. This feeling does not always appear in obvious ways. It can remain beneath the surface, influencing your reactions without needing to be fully noticed. You may reach a point that once felt meaningful, only to find that it does not bring the sense of completion you expected. That absence can feel confusing, especially when you are not sure what is missing. The experience itself has not changed, but the way it is being evaluated has. Because the standard continues to shift, the feeling of enough becomes difficult to hold on to. Even when something feels complete for a moment, that feeling can fade as your attention moves elsewhere. This creates a subtle tension that stays present in a steady way. It can influence how you see your progress and how you respond to where you are. In that space, a quiet form of pressure can begin to build. It does not come from a single source, but from the way everything is being measured at once. And when that pressure continues without being clearly understood, it can begin to feel like something that is simply part of your experience. This feeling can continue in quiet ways, especially when the same way of measuring your life remains in place. You may find yourself returning to similar thoughts, even when your circumstances have already begun to change. There can be a sense that something is still incomplete, or that you have not yet reached a place you expected to arrive at. Those thoughts do not always feel new. They can feel familiar, as if they have been part of your thinking for a long time. That familiarity can make them easier to accept without needing to question where they come from. As they repeat, they begin to shape how you see your progress. Each time you reflect on where you are, the same pattern can quietly appear. You measure, you compare, and then you feel the result of that comparison. This creates a steady rhythm, one that continues without needing a clear starting point. The more it repeats, the more natural it can begin to feel. It can seem as though this is simply how you understand your life. In that process, your attention may begin to focus more on what feels unfinished. At the same time, what has already changed may not stand out as clearly. You may begin to notice gaps more easily than movement, and you may see distance more quickly than progress. Because of this, the feeling can stay present. It does not need something new to continue. It only needs the same way of looking to remain. This pattern can be difficult to step out of, even when you begin to notice it more clearly. It does not feel like something you chose. It can feel like something that has been there for a long time, quietly shaping how you see your life. Because of that, it can feel natural to continue following it. You may recognize the pattern and still find yourself returning to it. That does not mean you are doing something wrong. It reflects how familiar ways of thinking tend to stay in place. When something feels familiar, it can feel easier to stay with it. Even if it does not feel good, it can still feel known. And what feels known often feels more stable than what does not. This can make it harder to move away from the pattern, even when you begin to see it more clearly. there can be a quiet hesitation in stepping outside of it, not because you want to stay in it, but because leaving it feels uncertain. You may not know what replaces it. You may not know how to see your life without it. That uncertainty can feel uncomfortable in a different way. It is not the same as the pressure you have been feeling, but it is still something you are not used to. Because of this, the pattern can continue. It does not need to be reinforced in obvious ways. It continues simply because it has not been replaced. And what has not been replaced can remain, even when you are no longer fully aligned with it. This pattern can continue because it offers a sense of structure, even when that structure does not feel helpful. It gives you a way to understand where you are, even if that understanding feels incomplete. Without it, there can be a sense of not knowing how to measure your life. That uncertainty can feel unfamiliar in a quiet but noticeable way. Because of this, the pattern can feel easier to return to. It provides something to hold on to, even when it creates pressure. You may find yourself relying on it without fully deciding to. It becomes a way of organizing your thoughts about progress. When that structure is present, your mind knows how to respond. It knows how to evaluate where you are. Without it, there can be a pause. In that pause, there may not be a clear way to define what your life means in that moment. That absence of definition can feel uncertain. It can feel like something is missing, even when nothing is actually lacking. Because of this, the pattern can remain in place. It continues not because it is correct, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity can feel more stable than something new. When something feels stable, it can feel easier to stay with it. Even when it creates discomfort, it can still feel easier than stepping into something unknown. As this pattern continues, what stands out in your life can begin to change in subtle ways. Attention tends to move more easily toward what feels incomplete, while what has already shifted can become less noticeable. At first, this does not feel unusual. Everything can seem as though it is simply being observed as it is. Underneath that surface, however, the direction of your attention has already been shaped. A quiet pull can begin to form toward what has not happened yet. Meanwhile, what has already moved forward does not always receive the same level of focus. Because of this, your sense of progress can begin to feel smaller than it actually is. Change may still be happening, yet it does not always appear clearly in your awareness. Moments that once would have felt meaningful can pass without leaving the same impression. There can be a sense that something is missing, even when something has already taken place. This creates a narrower way of seeing your life. The pattern does not force this perspective. It simply guides where your attention tends to rest. Once that direction becomes familiar, it can continue without needing to be questioned. In that state, what is missing can begin to feel more present. Unfinished parts can feel closer than completed ones. What has already moved forward may still be there, but it may not stand out in the same way. Movement does not disappear. It just becomes quieter in your awareness. And when that happens, it can feel like less is changing than there really is. When this way of seeing continues, it can begin to feel like a clear reflection of reality. The perspective does not stand out as something created. It can feel as though it is simply showing you what is true. In that state, there is little reason to question it. Everything appears consistent with what you have been noticing. What feels incomplete continues to stand out. What has already changed continues to stay quieter in your awareness. Because of this, the feeling of being behind can begin to feel more certain, not because it has been proven, but because it has been seen in the same way repeatedly. Repetition can create a sense of clarity, even when something is not fully accurate. The more familiar a perspective becomes, the less it feels like a perspective. It can begin to feel like something fixed. From there, your reactions can begin to align with it. Choices, expectations, and interpretations can all begin to follow the same direction. This does not happen all at once. It forms gradually in the way your attention continues to move. Nothing about this feels forced. It feels natural. It feels consistent. And because it feels consistent, it can begin to feel true. Yet what feels true is not always the same as what is complete. A perspective can feel stable. At the same time, it can still leave parts of your experience unseen. Those parts do not disappear. They remain outside of what is being noticed. And when they are not being noticed, they do not feel present in the same way. As this perspective settles, the emotional experience that follows can begin to feel steady in its own way. There may not be a sharp sense of distress. Instead, a quieter form of pressure can begin to stay in the background. This pressure does not always demand attention. It can remain present without needing to be fully noticed. Moments that should feel complete can carry a slight sense of uncertainty. Something may feel just out of reach, even when nothing specific is missing. In that space, emotions do not always appear clearly. They can feel muted or slightly undefined. A sense of dissatisfaction may be there, though it is not always easy to explain. Because the perspective feels consistent, the emotional response can feel justified. There is a quiet sense that the feeling makes sense. It can seem as though the emotion is a natural result of what you are seeing. This makes it harder to question. The feeling does not stand out as something separate. It feels connected to what appears to be true. In that connection, the pressure can remain. It does not need to increase to have an effect. It simply stays, shaping how each moment is experienced. Some days, it may feel lighter. Other times, it may feel more present. Even so, it rarely feels completely absent. And in that steady presence, it can begin to feel like something that belongs there. As this emotional pattern continues, it can begin to sustain itself in quiet and consistent ways. The feeling does not need to become stronger in order to remain, because repetition alone can be enough to keep it present. Each time a similar perspective appears, a familiar emotional response can follow without needing to be forced. Nothing about this needs to feel intentional, and it often unfolds through the way your attention moves from one moment to the next. A thought appears and a feeling follows, and that feeling begins to shape how the next moment is experienced. In that flow, the pattern starts to reinforce itself without needing a clear starting point. There is no single moment where it begins, and no clear moment where it ends. Instead, there is a steady continuation, where each part connects to the next in a way that feels natural. Because the experience feels consistent, it can begin to feel reliable, and what feels reliable can begin to feel accurate. This does not mean the feeling reflects everything that is true, but it reflects what has been repeatedly seen and felt. Other parts of your experience can still be present, even if they are not receiving the same attention. They may exist in the background, without standing out in a way that feels immediate. Without attention, they do not carry the same weight, even though they have not disappeared. In that space, the emotional pattern continues, not because it is being actively reinforced, but because nothing has interrupted it. And when something continues in that way, it can begin to feel like the only way things are. At some point, a small shift in awareness can begin to appear, and it often arrives without needing a clear explanation. It does not come as a strong realization, but more as a quiet sense that something about the pattern is being seen differently. The thoughts may still be there, and the feeling may still follow in familiar ways, yet the experience of them begins to feel slightly less fixed. There can be a moment where you notice the pattern itself rather than being fully inside it. That moment does not change everything at once, and it does not remove the feeling right away. What it does is introduce a small amount of space into the experience. Within that space, the sense of certainty can begin to soften. What once felt solid may begin to feel less absolute, even if it has not completely changed. This does not require effort, and it does not depend on forcing a different way of thinking. It happens as awareness begins to recognize what has been repeating. Once something is seen, it is no longer completely invisible, and that alone begins to change how it is experienced. The pattern may still continue, but it may no longer feel like the only way of seeing your life. There can be a growing sense that what you have been feeling is connected to a certain perspective, rather than being a complete reflection of reality. In that recognition, something begins to loosen. The feeling remains, though it may not hold the same weight. And in that small shift, there is space for a different understanding to begin to form. As this shift in awareness becomes more familiar, the pressure that once felt constant can begin to soften in quiet ways. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for this change to begin. The same thoughts may still appear, and the same situations may continue, yet the way they are experienced starts to feel slightly different. There can be less urgency in how each moment is interpreted. What once felt like something that needed to be resolved may begin to feel like something that can simply be noticed. This does not remove the pattern. It changes your relationship to it. Instead of being pulled along by it, there can be a sense of moving with a bit more steadiness. That steadiness does not come from control. It comes from the space that has opened. Within that space, the need to measure begins to feel less immediate. Comparison may still appear, though it may not hold the same level of influence. A thought can pass without needing to define what it means. A feeling can remain without needing to be explained. In that way, the experience becomes lighter. Not because everything has changed, but because less is being carried at once. The pressure does not disappear completely. It becomes less fixed, and when something feels less fixed, it can begin to feel easier to move within it. As everything begins to settle, the question of whether you are behind may start to feel less certain than it once did. The same thoughts may still appear, though they may not carry the same weight. A familiar feeling can still be there, yet it may no longer define the entire experience. There can be a quiet sense that what you have been measuring was never as fixed as it seemed. The path you imagined may begin to feel less like something you were meant to follow in a specific way. Instead, it can feel more open, less defined, and less tied to a single direction. Nothing about your life needs to change for this to begin. The same moments are still there. The same progress is still unfolding. What changes is the way it is seen. Within that shift, there can be space for something softer. A sense that where you are may already be part of a complete path, even if it does not look the way you once expected. There may not be a clear answer to whether you are ahead or behind. That question may begin to matter less. What remains is the experience of moving through your life as it is, without needing to place it on a fixed timeline. And in that space, something can begin to feel a little more at ease.